Are you ready? Councilmember Ahman, whenever you're ready.
Okay. 6 o'clock, we'll call the city council meeting together, Labor Relations Committee meeting. Could we just, for the purpose of recording, go around the table and state who's here? Steve Ahman.
Bruce DeBlake.
Jim Dockin. Dennis Anderson.
Audrey Nelson.
Frank Yanish.
Kevin Halliday.
Charlene Stevens.
Thank you. The purpose of today's Labor Committee meeting is to update and educate the City Council and Mayor on labor laws, specifically regarding employers' rights and responsibilities. And this is all related to the interview process so that we're in conformance with all state laws. Robert, thank you for putting this together in such a short notice. Hope you came prepared, but we have, 45 minutes or 50 minutes maybe to get this done?
Certainly, and hopefully it won't take that long, but we'll do our best here.
Thank you. It's in your hands.
Councilmember Ahman, members of the committee and city council, obviously we're here today for interview training, and the specific reason we're here is the recent policy that the city council enacted, which is for city hires of department heads, a member of the Labor Committee chair or that chair's designee shall now serve on any interview committees established for making the hire of the department head. Obviously, if any of you that are members of the committee or any others that may from time to time be designated to serve on these interview panels find yourself in that capacity, the reason is because the city is making a hire of a department head position. And with that in mind, it's important to keep in mind what is the overriding purpose for the hiring process that the city has. And there's basically two main things. First and foremost, obviously, the city wants to find the best person for the position, find the best candidate. Secondly, you want to have a good process, a legal process, a fair process that doesn't subject the city to any claims of a legal nature or a contractual nature. The interview is an important but ultimately a small part of the hiring process. And to put it in context, there are a number of components of the hiring process that come both before and after the interview. Some of them are administrative. Some of them will require policy action by the city council. For example, when you're hiring a new department head, frequently our advice is for cities to take a look at if your job description is still appropriate or if that should be amended. Look at all the needs that you want this position to fill going forward and see if it needs to be changed in any way. My assumption is if that does in fact need to happen, it's a policy question that the council votes on to enact any such changes. Others are administrative, developing the application process, evaluating the applications that come in at a preliminary stage to determine who gets an interview. Those are all functions of the city administrator in the case of a hire for a department head. So certainly the interview is important, and it's just a small part of what happens, though, through the hiring process. After the interview, there's likely to be background checks, possibly other tests or examinations, and ultimately the final evaluation and a selection of the candidate to present to the city council for its approval or not. There are a myriad of laws and regulations that apply to the city's action throughout the hiring process. They apply at every step of the way, but they do apply in the interview process as well. I've highlighted some of them, not all of them, here on the screen. And the point of this training, just to be clear right now, is not to bring you fully up to speed on the ins and outs on every one of these laws. I've distilled a few bullet points of things to avoid asking in an interview that we'll talk about later. But I do want to raise your awareness that this is a tricky area. There's fraught with many potential pitfalls that if you're not aware could trip you up and create problems for the city. So if you find yourself in the capacity of serving on an interview panel, just keep in mind that there are lots of legal requirements that you need to comply with. I have a few handouts that I brought with me today that I'm going to give you now, if that's okay. Oh, I'm sorry, listen. The first handout that's being distributed now is a portion of the League of Minnesota Cities pretty comprehensive materials that they've put together to help cities through the hiring process. I've basically printed out the table of contents so you know everything the league addressed and the 7 pages that deal with specifically the interview process. You don't need to read it all right now. It's for your reference to refer back to if you need to in the future. A couple points to make though. I guess to illustrate the point I made a minute ago about the interview being important, but a small part of the process. The league's materials on hiring are 81 pages, and I think 6 or 7 of them talk about the interview process. There are a number of laws that apply throughout the process, but what I did give you is, I think, helpful. We rely on the league's materials quite a bit, and we think that what they've put together to illustrate the role that you play as an interviewer, if you find yourself on that panel, is helpful particularly. So I printed that off for you to have as a reference, for you to look back on and for you to consult in the event that you are serving on a panel to interview prospective candidates for a department head in the future. I've just touched on and made you aware that there are a number of laws, both federal and state laws, that apply throughout the hiring process. Before we get into the specific recommendations for serving on an interview panel, just to get everyone on the same page with regards to the city's laws that you have in place. You have a charter and city code in place. To summarize them, the city administrator is responsible for overseeing the hiring of department heads subject to the approval of the city council. And it's kind of like in the federal government executive nominations, which the executive comes up with a name, needs the approval essentially of usually the Senate. That's the kind of thing we're dealing with here. You also have a personnel policy in place that is consistent with your charter and your city code, which clarifies a few points with respect to department heads. The city administrator is responsible for contacting any references provided by the candidates. If there's additional examinations, whether written or physical, which may be unlikely in the case of a department head, the city administrator establishes that process and oversees it. Getting now to the real point of why we're here, the point of the interview process when you're hiring a department head or making any hire is to gather job-related information about the candidate. That's probably pretty obvious to most of you. There's a second purpose that might be less obvious, which is you want to convey the appearance of a professional and well-run and organized organization. You want to convince the candidates that you're interviewing that this is a good place to work. It works 2 ways. You don't want to turn off any candidates who are interviewing with you by having a less than cordial, respectful interview process, and you want to put your best foot forward just as the interviewees do. And I would add a third that's not on the slide, but related purpose of the interviews is to, 1, administer a fair process that isn't going to lead to any claims against the city, and two, to create a record that would help the city in the event that a claim is made anyway. Employment claims are fairly common. They're one of the major sources of litigation that cities get involved in. You can do your best, and this training is to give you the tools to do your best, but you might still find a claim made at some point, and if you've gone through the process and you've done it correctly and created the record to reflect that, you'll be in a much better position to defend any claims that are made. One of our recommendations, I think it's a common recommendation for cities when they're hiring positions, especially like department heads, is to create and establish an interview panel with a diverse set of perspectives, diverse viewpoints on the panel. The reason for that is explained in the league materials that I handed out a minute ago. It's that people have inherent biases that are in many cases not even conscious biases. They tend to feel more comfortable with people that are like them from similar social backgrounds as themselves. The interview panel is a mechanism to combat that and to bring some balance and perspective to the hiring process that one individual can't have. In the city's case, I talked to Charlene a little bit about the process she has used to find department head candidates and to select them once they've applied. And my understanding, and please feel free to jump in if I miss something or if it's incorrect, but my understanding is she has sought to have someone on the panel who is from outside the organization, someone who is experienced in the field for which the department head is being nominated, as well as a few different perspectives from within the organization.
That's accurate. Yes, that's correct. That's accurate.
And I think one of the objectives you usually have is to find someone who would be reporting to the person.
Yep, I typically also have involved somebody who would probably be a direct report to the individual to have that perspective as well.
So the city has, to my knowledge, followed our best practices for convening a diverse group of people to serve on the interview panel. The mechanics of the panels that the city administrator has convened, again, as I understand it, is they also follow, what they do is consistent with what we advise, which is that they put a lot of preparation in before the interviews are conducted. The questions are developed ahead of time. They are meant to be as consistent as possible between the candidates, which again is something we recommend and I'll touch on in a minute. Point being with all this is the interview isn't something to take lightly. It's not something to show up to without a clear idea of what you're going to ask, of what points you want to elicit information from the candidate about. My strong recommendation is if you find yourself on a panel and you have a specific concern with the position that will be hired and a specific set of qualifications you're looking for or questions that you would like to be asked, that you work through the city administrator to have those questions kind of vetted beforehand. The best way to avoid any inadvertent mistakes in the interview process is to know what you're going to ask and to stick to the script. There are certain characteristics of good interview questions, and I think I'll touch on those before talking about what you need to stay away from. The overarching theme is all your questions should be narrowly tailored to ask about specific job-related qualifications, experience, or training that the candidate has had. The rule of thumb is no personal questions. And it probably seems obvious when I say that, but I can't tell you how many times we've dealt with situations where someone on an interview panel has asked a personal question, and it is understandable, actually, because the interview setting is a lot different than the settings we find ourselves in most days. If you're meeting someone for the first time in a social setting, the types of questions that we're accustomed to asking of each other are very frequently of a personal nature. You know, are you married? Do you have kids? Things like that. Where do your kids go to school? All these personal questions that we are used to asking kind of as small talk or filler, they can all lead to trouble in the interview context. Everything needs to be focused entirely on the candidate's qualifications as they relate to the specific functions of the position that you're hiring. I mentioned earlier, one of the things we recommend is that to the extent you can possibly do so, given the varied experiences that candidates will bring to the table, try and ask the same questions, or at least ask questions about the same qualifications that a candidate has. They don't need to be verbatim the same script for each interview, but they should be designed to be as fair as possible and as consistent as possible to give every candidate the same hearing. Getting to the questions that should be avoided. And this is when maybe I can hand out my second handout.
We can do that for you. Here, just-
I believe, Robert, am I right or wrong on the citizenship issue?
I'm sorry?
As far as asking, as far as citizenship,
Yeah, I would recommend not asking that question.
that was my next question.
Again, this handout is intended to be a resource to you if you find yourself appointed to an interview panel. You can glance at it now, and I'll highlight a few of the areas covered here. This is, we think, one of the better guides we've seen as far as, this applies to the whole hiring process, not just the interviews, but it applies equally well to questions that you can ask in the interview process. It gets into some level of nuance about there are certain subjects that are okay to ask about if you ask in the right way, but there are certainly specific questions you cannot ask. Highlighting what some of those are on the screen now. The big ones, obviously, race, color, national origin, religion. Those are probably unsurprising to hear. There are some less obvious ones as well, though. You know, convictions, arrests, bankruptcies, whether someone's on public assistance or has ever received public assistance, sexual orientation, marital status, pregnancy, any medical conditions related to that, disabilities. These are questions you really shouldn't go near. And if there is something, if some specific concern about a candidate you're hiring and you're wondering if there's a way you can ask about it, absolutely, I would recommend working with the city administrator, or if you'd like, you can always give me a call as well. And we can advise you whether it's okay to touch the subject at all, and if so, how to do it, and if it's just something you can't ask, we'll let you know that as well. Getting away strictly from the bullet list of questions not to ask, which you have and you can refer to if you are preparing for an interview. There are some best practices that we recommend. Again, these are what we've found to be the best methods for the city to conduct interviews, to serve its overall interests in finding the best candidate and doing so in a way that's not going to expose the city to legal claims. First thing is to always treat the candidate for employment respectfully. And that, again, sounds obvious, but the key point here, I think, is if you have a candidate who doesn't answer a question to your satisfaction, our recommendation is not to let the interview become confrontational or argumentative. Certainly some reasonable follow-up questions are appropriate, but at all times try and keep your cards close to the vest. There's certainly time to have a discussion with the rest of the panel after the interview if there's a candidate that wasn't, in your opinion, to your, up to the task of the position you want to hire. You want to try and keep these friendly. It's more pleasant, but more importantly, it will make the candidate feel that they've had a fair hearing with you, that they were participating in a fair process, even if a candidate was unqualified and didn't give a good answer to a question. Going through a argument or a process that's going to really highlight that or confront the candidate about that is not productive. It's going to leave a bad taste in the candidate's mouth. It's going to give them a bad impression. It will, if they perceived any other slights, make them more likely to explore those. Again, the place for the candid discussion about whether a candidate was qualified or not, or gave a good interview or not, is in the post-interview deliberations that the panel has.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Yes, Jim, Mr. Dockin, go ahead.
You indicated that maybe a candidate might be unqualified. How could that possibly happen? One would think that we would, if we had a number of candidates that had applied, that they would have been screened with respect to their job description and their duties and responsibilities. And if they don't have those qualifications, why would that candidate even be considered in the process? Because the most important thing is we're filling a position that has a job description and it has duties and responsibilities. Some of those duties and responsibilities are mandatory, that they have training and background in them. Others, of course, could be developed on the job. But it would be strange that we would have I would think that we would have a candidate who is unqualified.
Councilmember, that's a good question, and obviously you've touched on a key point. The pre-interview screening of applications that come in that is conducted in each case is very important. And if it works perfectly, you don't have a situation where you're interviewing someone who isn't qualified. And maybe I didn't phrase it correctly. Maybe I should have said not as qualified as someone else that had been interviewed. But certainly, no matter how rigorous your pre-screening can be, you can get candidates that are less impressive.
Yeah, and I think I can answer that, Councilmember, with another example, having done interviewing in a lot of different organizations. There are times where an organization may use a title differently than another organization, and I can think of examples in the past when I was hiring for fire, and not with our recent one, but departments may list a battalion chief, and a battalion chief in one community may have different duties than a battalion chief in another, or a deputy chief may appear to be a second in command, but the way that a different department is structured, they may actually be more of a battalion chief, and so you screen those out as best you can in the resume process, but sometimes it does, when you start to talk with an individual, you realize that the scope of their duties may not have been as broad as you thought based upon the title, because how your organization uses the title and how another organization uses the title may be very different.
I know, Ed, that's an illustration of why you have interviews, of why the interview is an integral part of hiring a good candidate.
Thank you.
So I talked about, in addition to avoiding, unpleasant arguments or anything short of an argument that's still a little awkward in the interview, try and always keep a warm, friendly, non-judgmental environment in the interview. It will only serve the city's interests in the long run. Another recommendation we have, not just for Wilmer, but in any cities that have elected officials serving on interview panels for positions like department heads, it's important that the entire panel work productively and work cooperatively together. In this case, the city administrator oversees the process. We strongly recommend that whoever is on the panel work in a friendly and productive manner with the city administrator. Obviously, the council voted to put someone from the Labor Committee on these interview panels because it would like someone from that committee to have a role to play in this process, and by all means, play that role. And if you have specific concerns or ideas about what would make a good candidate, bring those to the table, but do so through this process, through this collaborative process with the interview panel, and I think the city's interests will be served in the long run, and you'll get the best hire. A final bullet here is to not discuss the interviews with anyone outside of the process that's set up in the interview with the panel and with the deliberations that are arranged after the interviews are completed. And we'll get into why in a minute here. I'm actually going to skip ahead a slide and then come back. The Data Practices Act does apply in this context. We talked about when I was here to talk about data practices management, data practices issues in general. We talked about personnel data. Unlike in most areas where the city has information in its possession, the presumption with personnel data is that it is private. There are specific categories of data that are public, and I've listed those here. It's very limited. Before the interviews have been set up, the candidates' names aren't even public. Only once you've identified the finalists and identified the candidates that are going to be interviewed do their names even become public. The rest of it is right up here: work availability, education and training, job history, if this is a union position, if there's an eligible list where they rank, veteran status is limited. The vast majority of the information you'll receive needs to be kept confidential. Which raises the topic of notes. People have different preferences for whether they will take written notes during an interview. It's really unique to the individual. If you are one that finds it helpful to take notes, as I am, I find that I retain things much better if I'm writing along as I am listening. If you're like me and you do take notes in the interview, you need to be as mindful about what you write down as you are about any questions you'd ask in the interview. The notes themselves could become public data. They could become evidence if there ever does become a legal case involving the employee or the candidate for employment that is being interviewed. Every consideration that you give to whether you can ask a question or not should be, you should keep that in mind as you're taking notes in the interview. It needs to be evidence that you're considering the right things. It shouldn't be subjective impressions that you have of the candidate, wholly subjective impressions. It should be focused on whether this candidate that you're interviewing is giving good answers, whether they seem to have the knowledge, the experience, the qualifications, the training that's needed for the position. And if you do that, and then the city is the subject of an action, then you have good evidence that whatever claim is being made against the city about how the process was unfair or discriminatory isn't correct, because this is what we considered. We took notes at the time, and this is why this panel member recommended hiring someone else. So it's a best practice. It's important because if you don't do it right, it works the opposite effect, and it can be a problem for the city. The final bullet on interview notes, there should be, from start to finish of the hiring process, covering all the steps that were listed at the beginning, not just the interview. There should be a main application file kept on each candidate, and I presume the city administrator has control of that.
Yes.
And our recommendation, and I think it's probably a requirement under the Data Practices Act, that if you do take notes during the interviews, that those go in the application file.
Yes.
Yes, that's how we keep all of our application files
Okay.
and all of our interview processes.
With that, I don't have anything else. I guess I would just reiterate that the interview is definitely, if you find yourself on a panel, it's definitely something to prepare for in advance. It's not something to come to and think you're going to think of great questions to ask on the spot. That's how cities can get in trouble. It's important to think about what is it we want to know about this candidate beforehand, to work through the team process with the panel that's going to be interviewing all the candidates, to do it that way and to vet everything ahead of time. Are there any questions for me at this point?
Mr. Anderson?
I don't think this will happen, but I have been in interview situations where when the interview is done, they'll say, okay, now let's divvy up and you do 3 background checks and you do 3 and you do 3. And I suspect that there are as many legal pitfalls and problems doing background checks or reference checks as there are doing in the interview process.
Correct, yeah, we want a streamlined process for background checks, investigations. I mean, another recommendation we have, don't take any matters into your own hands.
It's just,
The interview is a small part of this, so this training's obviously been focused on how to handle an interview, but the rest of the hiring process is still with the city administrator ultimately.
okay.
So it's important to respect that and to work through that process. Towards that as well, I would add, I guess, don't seek to contact any candidates. I don't expect that would happen. I don't expect you'd get calls, but in the event you serve on a panel and then are contacted either before or after the actual interview by one of the candidates, don't take the call, or, if you find yourself in that situation, refer all questions to the city administrator. It's important that the city speak to candidates for employment with one voice, and the city administrator will be ready and qualified to do that. Any other questions?
Thank you, Robert. Just want to make a note, since this is recorded, Councilman Christensen joined us shortly after the meeting started. I have a question for you, and I know it might be pertinent, may not, but in a situation, and how many interviews you've taken, but in a situation where undue influence or outside influence, since you're dealing with a government entity, can be beneficial maybe to some people more than others in the community, depending on how you look at it. If there's outside influence, is that a question that can be asked if you've been contacted by the groups or prior to, because prior to the interview process, because the candidates usually are publicized? Is that a legal question that can be asked or not asked? And would it have any what would the circumstances be in the hiring process if they were and the information was not truthful?
I would say that it's a question that you should treat
It's a tough
very
one.
carefully. And
I understand that. That's why I'm asking
the
you.
problem is, there may not be anything wrong per se with asking someone if they've had discussions with anyone about a specific position, except you don't know what the answer might be. And if the answer is, I've had contact with an organization that, would only be relevant because I am a participant of their religion or a member of the ethnicity for which the organization is formed. I don't know. That would be something, if you have a specific question you want to explore, I guess we might need to look at that in more detail, and I'd encourage you to, or whoever would be on the panel, to either contact Charlene or give me a call.
Any other questions? Bruce?
Yeah, thank you. With reasonable accommodations, how far do you have to go for reasonable accommodations during an interview process?
Insofar as trying to determine if someone would be,
Does an applicant have to request reasonable accommodations before the interview, or?
as far as whether they can perform the ultimate functions of the job?
That, and as well as, just your interview room and the like, so, if somebody comes in and,
It's highly fact-dependent. It would, if it's a matter of physical access in the interview, I would expect that you would have to go to pretty great lengths to try and accommodate the person. The bottom line, as far as whether a person with a disability can perform the job or not, is there are specific functions of the job and responsibilities of the position that the city would have already in place in the job description. And if the person can perform those with some reasonable accommodations, they cannot be excluded because of their disability. They cannot be discriminated against for that.
okay. And then, I think Dennis mentioned the background checks and that there, but how about, can you require drug and alcohol testing of somebody after you do, an initial job offer?
Yes, there is an opportunity to do that. It has to be done pursuant to specific procedures. I don't know what the city's policy, to be honest, is on that for whether it applies citywide or to certain positions.
Employers can ask for testing.
It has to be, related to the,
Yeah,
to the actual functions of the job. That gets a little beyond the interview process.
well, there's so many from different categories. Driving, and some of these guys are CDLs, so they have to follow the state MnDOT criteria for that. Our background checks with the police department are different if you're driving, whether you're clerical and sitting there, because the driving record needs to be there. So generally with driving records, we do a drug and alcohol test. All firefighters do that. And a major physical, they're a different category too, because we like to get a base medical on some people. That way you know where they might advance on certain things, like hearing loss and other things. So there's too many categories really to talk about each one. It's job dependent.
It is, and that's something that is, I would say, looked at on a case-by-case basis for whatever position you're hiring or class of positions, if it's.
But my understanding is a drug and alcohol test can be performed if you give them due notice.
Yeah, there's notice requirements anytime you want to set up a testing regime like that.
Oh, no, I'm talking about existing employees.
Yeah,
It's other-
I'd have to look at that to give you a specific answer, but there's always notice requirements.
Is recording optional or mandatory in the interview process when we're interviewing the final?
It is not mandatory,
Okay.
unless, of course, a given panel were to have a quorum of the city council on it, or one of the committees, or the Civil Service Commission, for example, but no, it's not subject to.
Okay, there's no other
Recording
separate
requirements
separate
anymore.
guidelines that government has to follow in this particular case in the interview.
Yeah, you're not subject to the same requirements you are for an open meeting of a
Okay.
city council or one of your committees, for example.
Okay, and as far as for legal purposes, you don't feel that recording the interviews is appropriate? Or would they have to be, or if that was going to be considered just for clarity, would that, they would have to be notified of it being recorded, correct?
Yeah, I don't know what your practice is, Shirley?
We do not record the interviews. I think, and I wouldn't recommend that we do
Yeah.
either. I think it's not a practice that's common. I think it might be off-putting to the candidates.
Yeah, I agree. If it were to happen, certainly you'd have to give them notice that it is going to be
Right.
recorded, but.
Right,
I-
okay.
I-
I
yeah,
wasn't
Our
sure what the
experience hasn't
practice
been
was.
that they're typically recorded.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Bruce?
Yes, another question, when you're, the background checks, can can you do, like Google searches on the applicant and check their background in that fashion? Is that
Yeah, you
got
can.
a proper way
You
to-
can certainly search public information like that. Again, the strong recommendation is that the city administrator oversee even those functions, so that you have a streamlined process applicable to everyone, and you can prove that it was carried out impartially and consistently.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments by City Councilman Ron?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe you could email or the slideshow you had and the information you gave us so we could keep it in our
Absolutely. Yep.
pads. Thank you.
Good idea. If there's no further business, I believe that was the only issue on the agenda, was to have Robert explain this to you. Thank you, Robert, for your brief but very thorough information you gave us on employment.
Thank you.
Hiring process, and thanks for putting that together for us. Call for an adjournment.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
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 We're out of here.